Hello and welcome to Spiritually Speaking. I am Pastor Stacy Shelton, pastor of Medford First Christian Church. I'm here with Father Joel Maiorano, who is the head of chaplaincy at Rogue Valley Manor and sister communities. Today we are looking at Matthew 14, and Joel is going to read it for us.
I give thanks to Pastor Stacy for putting up with me. Our passage today is chapter 14, verses 13 verses to 21. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed. They followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." They answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You know, the first thing that sticks out to me in this passage is Jesus was moved by compassion. And when I looked up the word compassion, I noticed that it was not only a movement, it's beyond just having pity, but it was beyond a movement that happens within inside of a heart. And for the Hebrew, the heart involved the soul and the head. Mm-hmm. By feeling. So Jesus felt a deep feeling within inside of him that moved him towards action. And this is what the word compassion means. And this is what Jesus was wrestling with when he saw the people in need.
Yeah. Well, I think compassion is the bottom line in this text for me. I think also...
I feel like I heard that before.
Yeah, you might have. I think also it's important to point out, to think about where Jesus is coming from when we get to this text. It says when Jesus heard what had happened. Well, what had happened was the beheading of John the Baptist by Herod, and the story that happens in chapter 14 right before this text is, if you have a middle school boy in your family, you should read that to them because it is gruesome. Pretty disgusting, as the head of John the Baptist is served up at a birthday party. So Jesus has received this information somehow, and intriguingly and importantly, I think he has taken that information and has decided that he needs to withdraw and be alone for a while. I think for those of us who serve others and sort of live in the land of extroverts in some ways, it's really important to take note of Jesus's behavior at the beginning of this, that he's trying to take time for himself to recover from some pretty brutal news. And then maybe in a display of what isn't totally known as self-care, he sees the crowd of people and has compassion upon them and begins to heal their sick. But I think there's an important piece in that what motivates Jesus is the sense of compassion. It's pretty important in that text. Yeah.
I like you bring up perfectly, and I thought about it too, but I didn't make the same bridge that you made. That prior to this passage in chapter 14, there's another celebration, another party.
Yeah.
One centered around power and manipulation and death. And here we have a passage, a celebration passage, about sharing, about openness, and about caring.
Yeah.
Centered around compassion.
Yep.
And you're right. Earlier, Pastor Stacy and I were talking, and she made me think about what Jesus may have been going through when he heard his cousin, one of his close friends, John the Baptist, was killed. He probably wanted to spend some time alone.
Yeah.
And yet he was moved by the needs of the people and then chose to respond to them.
Yeah. And I do think that's an important piece of the self-care conversation here, is that Jesus does make a choice, and he makes it out of a sense of love, not out of a sense of guilt. And I think that's a pretty important piece. And as we look at caring for our own selves in the midst of caring for other people, what's the driving force? And when the driving force becomes guilt, that's a time when maybe we still need to say, no, I really do need to be alone right now, instead of moving in and being with others. So
that's a really good point. You mind if we go off task here for a second?
Sure.
I want to talk about the story and tell a story, but it has nothing to do with this story.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, I remember once working with a very passive-aggressive chaplain who was angry at me for leaving the religious tradition that she was part of, and would take different pot shots at me and then try to talk down to me, and often try to explain the Bible, even though they didn't have a Bible degree, about what it really said. And I remember her coming to me once and telling me that this passage, and then giving a different interpretation of it. And I had heard that interpretation, and it's actually a miracle interpretation too. Instead of Jesus reproducing the loaves and the fish, people shared with each other. People would walk from place to place because they didn't have a 7-Eleven, and they'd carry their food with them.
Yeah.
And at the time of this conversation, they started sharing food with one another. But as she talked down to me and tried to explain it to me because I was unaware or did not know, I had to stop her. And that was a perfect place for me to establish a boundary with her and say I knew about that interpretation, and then I showed the challenges with that interpretation. But she didn't really want to hear my opinion of it. She wanted to share her truth with me. And I had just left the academic world, and I always left room for the student in the classroom to bring their version of the truth to the story, or their story to the meta story. You always leave room when you tell a story for someone else to bring their thoughts of the story to the greater story, to the bigger story. And for me, it was important for me to set boundaries with her and say, yes, but there's more to it than what you're trying to dictate to me. Now, that was boundary setting. But there is a part of this story where I need to apply to my life. And a couple of years ago, my friend, who's a pastor, we both know Randy, we were in Pasadena doing a fellowship for clergy, and we walked past the same homeless person for 3 days holding up the same sign. And the sign says, I dream of a hamburger. And on the third day, I passed him, I turned to Randy, and I said, I dream this guy gets a job.
Ouch.
Now, yeah. And I meant it. But guess what? It was judgmental. Did I know this person's story? Did I see this person as a person, or did I see them as homeless begging? I didn't know their backstory. I didn't know what they were going through. I was just tired of seeing the sign, and I made a crass judgment on them.
Yeah.
Jesus here sees the people in need. He heals and he feeds them. He sees them as people. And so I think it's really important when we study this compassion, we realize that Christ sees them in the image, created in the image of God.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Well, and I
Yeah.
think a couple of things about that. These two interpretations that we get from this text, the one being that Jesus just multiplied the food that they had, and the other being that people shared. When I look at both of those things, I think both of those things are miraculous. Both of those things stem from compassion and are both very beautiful in their own right. It used to be fairly important to me, as it sounds like it was to the chaplain talking to you, to like try and figure out how to explain how this could have happened. This story is in all four Gospels, which isn't completely rare, but it isn't overly common as well. So it's one that comes up a lot, and for me, I used to need to logic some things away, and now as I look at it, what I receive from either interpretation is about love of people and humanity, and figuring out how to create solutions when faced with an obstacle. And I think it's really important that we understand, regardless of how we're going to interpret that that's what this is about, that the bottom line here is love. And I also, really love the piece about judgment, and I guess I'm almost wondering if compassion and judgment can coexist in the same moment. If we truly have compassion, I think we can't hold on to judgment at the same time. And so really, as I look at feeding people, which is a big part of what we do here at MFCC, doing that motivated by compassion and without judgment, and that piece about not knowing his story. We don't know the stories of, the couple hundred people that we serve food to every week. We don't know the background story. And just reminding myself of that, I think, is a call I hear from this text, that to do that solely out of compassion and go ahead and leave the judgment at home.
Right, and I think, for me and for people in community together, I think we have to differentiate between setting boundaries and passing judgment. I mean, recently someone asked me, "Well, I heard you when you disagree with someone, you disagree with them," and I tried to better understand what that meant, because yes, I do share my disagreements with people, and I'm a bit loud, or I let my opinions be known, but after we have the conversation, it's time to move on. The time I don't move on is when I disagree with someone's behavior.
Yeah.
And so when we disagree with someone's toxic behavior, I think we've got to say, this is unacceptable. That's a boundary.
Yeah.
We see it with domestic violence. We see it in violence. We see it in Christian scripture. Jesus is going to respond to people's behavior. And in this particular passage, when I made a judgment against the homeless person, that was a behavioral issue.
Right.
Now, centered around how I saw that person. So I'd say, let's be conscious. We got to set boundaries. I spent a whole night with somebody recently whose son came unglued, and the best thing to do was to not try to have those two speak.
Right.
Set boundaries, move to different areas.
Yes. Yeah.
But here, Jesus had compassion. He's calling us to join him in compassion for the people.
Yeah. Well, and I think, just in retrospect, some of the conversations I've had with really amazing church folk who have been trying to reach out and help other folks who are struggling. Sometimes it's that difference between, we have to have that conversation that setting a boundary doesn't mean you're not being compassionate. There may have been too many negatives in that sentence, but and I think as church people who are working and trying really hard to follow in Jesus's footsteps, sometimes it gets a little confusing about how much of ourselves we are supposed to sacrifice for the other person. I think you bring up a really important point about boundaries and just making sure that while compassion is a really important thing, that we do it within that piece of compassion, that we do create boundaries so that people aren't just behaving very poorly.
Bad. One of the things I love about the interpretation of thinking the real miracle was the people sharing their food with everyone is this is a very specific area where food insecurity was great.
Yeah. Yep.
The have had and have nots had not. And so here, people actually sharing food, they had to feel secure.
Yeah.
Or they had to feel like there were going to be enough for them. And rebellions in all of the Roman world happened when basic needs weren't being met.
Right.
And yet here we see Jesus addressing both healing and food. Now this had to make some people mad.
Yeah.
That they were going to hear this prophet.
Yeah. It's a huge, to have that many people. And it says 5,000 men, and that doesn't even count the women and children because they never counted the women and children. This is a huge group of people, and for the powers that be at the time to have allowed that to happen, that's I think they didn't know what was going on or something, because it would have been such a threat. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want you to know, Pastor Stacy, you count with me.
Thank you, Joel. I knew it.
Yeah. So, 795 million people in our world struggle with food insecurity or healthy food for healthy lives. That's 1 out of 9 people.
Yeah.
Even today. And yet here we see people sharing. All ate and were filled. Yeah. And that's amazing. And then they had 12 baskets, one for every disciple, I guess.
Yeah.
12 basketfuls. I think that's to show abundance.
Yeah.
I'm like, who's counting how many baskets?
Right.
I think 12 is a number.
Keeping track.
Yeah. I think 12 is a number.
Yeah.
That's more of a symbolic number to say that everything was copacetic.
Yeah. Well, and I think in this text, along with this piece of compassion, and it's a part of that, there's this sense of scarcity versus abundance kind of throughout. And I think in my own life, when I am able to live in a sense of abundance, and that doesn't mean that I have everything, but it means that my perception is that I have what I need. I am so much happier than when I'm living in a sense of scarcity. And I think that conversation that Jesus and the disciples have of him just being like, no, you guys go do it, you take care of it, is him sort of saying, believe in your abundance, believe in their abundance, and just let it be. So
I like that passage too when he says, no, we're going to feed them. You go out and do it. That's like, Apprentice 101. I'm gonna teach you discipleship, and now
you do it.
Do it. And John Stott, a great theologian, confronted Billy Graham in the 70s when a bunch of theologians got together, and Billy Graham was known to say, "I'm not going to engage in any protests, and I'm not going to address anything. I'm going to try to win people to have a relationship with Christ and be saved." And John Stott said, "No, I'm not signing that." And several others said, "I'm not signing that," and pushed Billy Graham to realize that the physical needs were just as important as spiritual needs. And Christ demonstrates that right here.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. But if I didn't mention it, I just wanted to mention again, you count in my book. They might have not counted you in this passage, but you count in my book. I
don't count to Jesus, but I count to Joel.
That's right. That's right. And if I have to hear another man or person tell me how much they love Pastor Stacy, I might stop counting you.
All right, take home in this for me is really twofold, a reminder to compassion, a reminder, that piece around Jesus being moved by compassion is really important for my self-care right now, and to allow myself to wait for that sense of compassion to move me into action. And I'm in the right place, because I really do value that piece of spiritual care and physical care, and this community here is so amazing about feeding people and really taking that on, and so inspiring to me to be able to watch how they do that tirelessly and beautifully. And for me, that call to compassion of both spirit and a body is pretty important.
Yeah. Number one take home for me. Number one thing I'm going to take home is you count. You count, Pastor Stacy, to me.
I'm going to hurt him.
Yeah. Number two thing.
As soon as I turn this off.
Yeah. If she turns this off, I'm dead meat. But anyway.
Now we'll be here forever.
We'll be here forever. But second thing I'm going to take home is that I struggle. I struggle sometimes looking at people who have different belief systems or different ideologies or different political agendas than I do. And I forget to see them as Christ saw them, as made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so to have compassion on humanity and on people's needs, I have to see them as God saw them. And I've got to look at them as God looked at them, with love. And so for me, the thing I'm going to take home is I'm going to remember how Christ saw the people, and then how he responded out of compassion, not out of guilt.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. It's important.
You count, Pastor Stacy.
You do too, Joel.
Thank you.
But you already knew that. And so do all of you. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Have a blessed day, including you, Debbie Watt.